He lost everything in restaurants and bought an old house to resell with his last money. But inside the closet, he found something he shouldn't have seen. It changed his path and led him where he didn't plan to go. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The day Ryan Miller signed the papers for the old hilltop house, the sky hung low over the town like a heavy wool blanket. Clouds pressed against the rooftops, muting every sound, flattening every color. It was the sort of morning when people stayed indoors, when even the wind seemed tired. Ryan stood on the cracked front steps of the property he had just bought with the last of his savings, hands deep in his jacket pockets, staring at the weather-beaten boards and the sagging porch railings. The house was crooked in places, patched in others, with paint peeling like old parchment. But something about it felt still and expectant, as if it had been holding its breath for years and had finally decided to exhale the moment he arrived. He wasn't sure why he had chosen this place out of all the listings he'd seen. Maybe because it was cheap. Maybe because it stood far from the noise and pressure of the city, on the outskirts of a town where no one knew him and no one whispered about his failures. Or maybe because some part of him, buried beneath months of exhaustion and disappointment, was desperate for a place that felt untouched by everything that had collapsed in his life. The house was old, but it had survived, and standing before it, Ryan felt for the first time in months that he might be able to survive too. His realtor, a woman with too bright lipstick and too practiced optimism, had insisted it was a fixer-upper with potential. She'd said the floors were solid, the roof didn't leak much, and the structure had good bones. She spoke as if she were describing an elderly dog with cloudy eyes that could still fetch a stick if the ground was flat enough. Ryan didn't mind. He wasn't looking for perfection. He only needed a starting point. Something simple. Something he could fix with his hands instead of his heart. The front door resisted when he pushed it open, scraping against the warped floorboards. A stale mixture of dust, dry wood, and something warm but forgotten drifted from inside, like a memory that had grown still and heavy from lack of use. The living room was dim, the windows cloudy with grime, but as he stepped in, the air shifted around him with a faint sigh, as though the house recognized the presence of someone new. His boots creaked on the floor, each step scattering dust that swirled lazily in the shadows. He walked slowly through the rooms, past the small kitchen with its ancient stove, the narrow hallway lined with faded floral wallpaper, and the empty bedroom upstairs that smelled faintly of pine. Everything felt untouched, as if the house had been waiting not just months, but years for someone to fill its silence. It was not warm or welcoming, but neither was it hostile. It was simply patient, inhabited only by time. When he descended into the lower level, the half-basement, half-first-floor space that sat partially beneath ground, he noticed how much cooler it was. The air felt denser there, stiller. A single small window near the ceiling let in a narrow stripe of daylight. The walls were lined with shelves, each crowded with jars of old screws, bits of twine, rusted nails, and tools that looked like they belonged to another era. This room had once clearly been a workshop or a storage place for someone who used his hands the way Ryan wanted to use his now. Slowly, purposefully, without the pressure of customers or reviews or weekend crowds. It was near the base of the wooden staircase, leading back up to the main floor, that he saw the cabinet. At first glance, it seemed like any other heavy, old-fashioned wardrobe, tall, dark, built from some sturdy wood that had outlasted several generations. But something about its position struck him as wrong. It stood pressed directly against the staircase, occupying a corner of the room in such a way that moving it even a few inches would require considerable strength. No one would place a wardrobe there by accident. It blocked part of the wall, nearly enough to make the staircase feel cramped. And yet, there it stood, as though someone had placed it with intention, perhaps to hide something. Ryan approached it cautiously. The wardrobe's doors were shut tightly, its brass handles dulled with age, yet strangely free of dust, as though someone had touched them recently, despite the thick layers of neglect elsewhere in the house. He felt the faintest pull of curiosity, a small spark in the fog of his exhaustion. For weeks, he had felt numb. This house, with its strange stillness, was the first place to stir something inside him. He tugged gently on one of the doors. It opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a set of old coats, a few tools, and a stack of wooden boxes. Nothing unusual. But when he tried to push the wardrobe slightly to the side, intending to clean behind it, he nearly stumbled. The wardrobe barely moved. It felt anchored, no, embedded in the floor. He put both hands against the side and pushed harder. The wood creaked, dust rose in a thick cloud, and then he heard it, a faint metallic thud. He froze. That sound didn't belong to wood scraping against cement. It was heavier, deeper. A safe? A hatch? A hidden panel? He stepped back, studying the wardrobe anew. The sides didn't line up perfectly with the wall. There was a sliver of darkness between the wardrobe's rear and the concrete, and as he leaned closer, he felt it. A faint breath of cool air escaping from behind the panels. His heartbeat kicked up, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. It was the first time in years that anything in his life had felt remotely like a possibility. Everything before this day had been struggle and decline. But now, in a dim basement of a forgotten house, a thin stream of cold air made him feel alive. He grabbed the side of the wardrobe again and pulled with more force. Muscles in his arms strained. Dust sifted down like powdered bone. Inch by inch, the wardrobe scraped across the cement floor until the gap widened enough for him to see behind it. There, carved directly into the wall, was a recessed cavity. And in that cavity stood a dark, heavy steel safe. It was decades old, its metal surface mottled with patches of rust. Yet the dial lock was intact, sturdy, and meticulously built. Someone had gone to significant effort to hide it. Someone had built the wardrobe positioning, the anchoring, the entire arrangement of the room around this one object. Ryan stepped closer, unable to tear his eyes from the sight. It was not the kind of safe someone used for spare cash or knickknacks. This was the sort of safe that held something meant to stay concealed, something valuable, something important. He rested his hand on the cold steel. For a moment, he hesitated. He had just moved into the house. This wasn't his. Whatever lay behind the heavy metal door belonged to another life, another man's story. But that story was now built into the bones of the house he owned. And in a strange, quiet way, he felt the house inviting him deeper, asking him to understand it, not just repair it. He shook the dial experimentally. It clicked softly beneath his fingertips, the sound echoing faintly in the dusty room. He tried a few simple combinations, birthdays, repeated numbers, anything that came to mind. But nothing worked. For several minutes, he stood staring at the safe, the stale air thick around him, his thoughts drifting between curiosity and caution. Then, almost without thinking, he knelt and pressed his forehead lightly against the cool metal, listening. A faint memory tugged at him, one of the many jobs he'd taken before opening his first restaurant, back when he worked at a diner where the owner had taught him how to listen to the tumblers of a safe. A worn-down trick for old-fashioned combination locks. The owner had joked that it was the closest thing to magic a cook would ever learn. Ryan adjusted his posture, gently turning the dial, slowly, carefully. He listened for the softest click, the subtlest shift in pressure. He felt ridiculous, crouched in a basement trying to crack a safe like some desperate scavenger. Yet there was something strangely grounding about the process. It was slow, deliberate, exact. Nothing like the frantic pace of running kitchens, the chaos of dinner rushes, the suffocating pressure of reviews and profit margins. Click. He froze. That had been real. A soft, delicate sound, hidden in the hum of silence. He turned the dial in the opposite direction, slower this time. When another click sounded, he nearly laughed from the shock of it. A thrill danced up his spine, thin, bright, surprising. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything close to excitement. One more turn, one more click, and then the dial stopped resisting. The heavy metal door swung open with a weighty sigh, like something that hadn't been touched in decades releasing its final breath. Inside, neatly arranged, as if packed with care rather than haste, were bundles of cash wrapped in faded paper straps, several velvet-lined boxes holding gemstones and jewelry, a stack of old certificates and documents, and near the back, wrapped tightly in clear plastic, a slim black leather notebook. Ryan reached into the safe slowly, as if afraid the contents might vanish. His fingers brushed over the leather spine of the notebook. The material felt warm, almost alive beneath his touch. He pulled it out carefully, the weight of it modest but significant. He peeled back the plastic, revealing the cover embossed with a single name: L. Drayton. The air around him felt suddenly heavier, as though the name alone carried a gravity the room had been waiting to acknowledge. He had heard the name Drayton somewhere, maybe in passing, maybe in the stories locals told about a reclusive man who had once lived quietly with a fortune no one ever understood. But those had been rumors, bits of gossip tossed around for years. No one seemed to know the truth. He opened the notebook to the first page. In steady, deliberate handwriting were the words: "My name is Lawrence Drayton. If you found this, then you're searching for something. I hope you're ready for the truth about failure and about building something that lasts." Ryan closed the notebook slowly, holding it against his chest, as he sat back on the cold cement floor. The workshop was silent around him, the dust dancing in the thin beam of the lone window. Outside, the clouds still pressed against the hills, but inside him, something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel as if he had lost everything. He felt as if he had just begun. For a long moment after discovering the safe, Ryan remained seated on the cold cement floor of the basement, the leather notebook resting in his hands like an object from another lifetime. The dust in the air swirled in thin, trembling currents, catching the faint light from the small basement window, and he felt as though the entire house had shifted its weight, settling into a new kind of silence. The discovery had changed something intangible, but profound. Before opening that metal door, he had simply been a man trying to salvage the remains of his life. Now, he felt as if he had stepped into someone else's unfinished story, one waiting for him in the quiet shadows beneath the staircase. When he finally pushed himself to his feet, the notebook still pressed against his palm, he sensed that the air around him carried a subtle hum, the kind found in the moments just before a storm, not threatening, just charged with possibility. He stood and carried the notebook upstairs, wanting air and light to sort through whatever it was he had just inherited. The old steps creaked under his weight in soft protest, and the house seemed to exhale with him as he reached the main floor. In the kitchen, sunlight filtered through a grimy window, warming a patch of worn linoleum near the sink. He sat at the small table pushed against the wall, flipped open the notebook, and began to read. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, the kind that belonged to a man who took his time with his words. The first entries introduced him to the writer, Lawrence Drayton, whose name he had recognized only in passing, mostly as a whisper in local business circles. Drayton had always been something of a mystery, a man who had made a vast fortune, but lived so quietly that people wondered whether the rumors about him were exaggerated or simply misunderstood. In the notebook, however, Drayton was not a mystery. He was raw, direct, and unexpectedly vulnerable. Ryan read with his elbows braced on the table, his eyes moving slowly across each line. Lawrence spoke about loss, about the early years when he had tried and failed in every venture he attempted. Failed restaurants, failed investments, failed partnerships. Each failure described with brutal honesty, noting every error, every misplaced assumption, every lesson learned too late. But woven through those confessions was something else, an unshakable belief that success was not a matter of genius or luck, but endurance, discipline, and the willingness to rebuild after every collapse. Drayton had written that failure was not just a possibility in business, it was a requirement. It carved out what didn't work, making room for what eventually would. Ryan read page after page, absorbing the wisdom like a man who had been wandering through fog for years and had finally found a guide. When he reached the section where Drayton began documenting the rise of the business empire that had made him famous, Ryan leaned closer, drawn in by the intensity and clarity of the man's strategy. Drayton outlined how he built his fortune. Slow, deliberate steps, each rooted in patience rather than ambition, each move calculated with both prudence and creativity. He described not chasing trends, but studying needs, not seeking attention, but building quietly until the world could no longer ignore what he had created. And most strikingly, Drayton wrote about how he had lived in this very house, this small, unassuming home on a hillside, even after becoming wealthy. He had never moved into a mansion. He had never traded his old habits for extravagance. Instead, he filled this house with his notebooks, his thoughts, and his discipline. The wealth he earned, he wrote, was simply a side effect of learning how to think clearly and work consistently. Ryan paused several times while reading, letting these ideas settle into the hollow places inside him. His own life had been marked by the opposite approach, rushing, improvising, hoping passion alone would carry him through the storms of the restaurant world. He remembered the nights he had locked himself in the kitchen after closing hours, exhausted and angry, trying to understand why everything kept slipping through his fingers. He had blamed circumstances, competitors, luck, rarely himself. Drayton's voice, quiet but steady, illuminated those memories with painful clarity. It wasn't that Ryan had been incapable, it was that he had been undisciplined, unfocused, and unwilling to build slowly. He turned the page and found a list labeled, "The Principles I Wish I'd Known Sooner." There were 10 entries. Each one was written simply, but their weight pressed into him with startling force. Build for longevity, not for applause. Correct. Don't complain. Teach yourself to think clearly. Emotion will blur the edges. Know why you're building before you start. When you fail, write down why. Work quietly. Let results speak. Patience is a wealth most men never earn. Protect your reputation. It's a currency. Never underestimate small beginnings. Leave something behind that outlasts you. Ryan read the list 3 times, running his thumb over the indentation left by Drayton's pen, feeling as though the older man were speaking directly to him across the years. He closed the notebook gently and sat back, staring at the kitchen wall. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with awakening. Something in him shifted, a slow and heavy realignment of thought. Perhaps he had not failed because he was incapable. Perhaps he had failed because he had never learned how to build with purpose. He had never worked with patience. He had hustled, but he had not planned. He had dreamed, but he had not designed. And now, holding Drayton's notebook, he felt something stirring in him that had been dormant for years. A desire to build something that mattered, something lasting, something rooted in discipline rather than desperation. As he turned to the final section of the notebook, he found entries written in a shakier hand, the ink slightly more faded, as though time had been weighing heavily on Drayton during the last months of his life. Here, the older man wrote not about business strategies, but about meaning. He spoke of legacy, mortality, and the quiet joy of spending years perfecting something simply because it felt right. Ryan paused when he reached the line that seemed to echo straight into the deepest part of him. A man becomes immortal only when he chooses what he wants the world to remember. Some build buildings, some build families, some build wealth. But the lasting ones build moments in others that continue long after they're gone. Ryan swallowed hard, closing the notebook with deliberate care. He stared at the worn cover for a long while, letting the words settle into him. He had come here expecting to flip a house, sell it, and move on with whatever little money he could salvage. But now, everything inside him resisted that idea. This house wasn't simply a structure to renovate and profit from. It was an inheritance of wisdom, a blueprint, an invitation. And beneath the weight of that realization, he felt a quiet resolve forming. Firm, steady, unshakable. He spent the next hour pacing slowly through the house, notebook in hand, letting the rooms guide his thoughts. The living room with its empty shelves, the kitchen with its faded counters, the hallway where the wallpaper peeled like old bark, the dining room where dust settled in thick layers on the table. Each room had potential, not in their current state, but in the way they could be transformed into something that breathed life rather than decay. He imagined light filling the spaces, tables filled with people, the sound of forks and laughter, the smell of food drifting through the hallways. He imagined a restaurant, not the kind he had once tried to run, frantic and overwhelmed, but something warm, intimate, rooted in the wisdom of Drayton's principles. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, listening to the stillness of the house around him. It felt different now. The silence no longer felt hollow. It felt waiting. By mid-afternoon, he had made a decision, and for the first time in years, it felt like the right decision. He found himself returning to the basement, standing before the open safe. The bundles of cash and jewelry lay neatly inside, untouched since he had uncovered them. He did not know why Drayton had hidden his wealth this way. Perhaps he had grown tired of thinking about money, or perhaps he had simply wanted to store it away until he found someone capable of using it meaningfully. Ryan reached for one bundle of cash, weighing it in his palm. He did not need much to begin. He only needed enough to breathe, to build slowly, carefully, patiently, exactly as Drayton had taught. He placed the money carefully on the workbench, then retrieved the notebook, holding it close as though it were a compass. With every line he reread, his purpose grew clearer. He was not going to flip the house. He was going to transform it, not just into a restaurant, but into a place built with intention, a place that felt like a continuation of Lawrence Drayton's quiet wisdom. In the days that followed, he began repairing the house with a sense of reverence. He cleaned each room meticulously, clearing dust and debris as though uncovering history. He washed the windows until sunlight flooded the rooms. He stripped the floors of their grime, revealing wood that gleamed faintly beneath years of neglect. The work was slow, steady, almost meditative. He found himself whispering some of Drayton's principles under his breath, using them as anchors whenever fatigue or doubt threatened his focus. Each evening, he returned to the basement, reading the notebook by the dim glow of a lamp, letting Drayton's voice guide him through his uncertainty. He planned carefully, refusing to rush into renovation decisions. He studied the town's needs, realizing that in a place like this, a small, quiet community, there was room for something personal, something rooted in warmth rather than spectacle. He imagined the restaurant he wanted to build. Not a large space, but a place where every detail had purpose. A place where guests felt at home. a place where he could build not just meals, but moments. And slowly, impossibly, he began to believe he could do it. He began to believe he could become someone new, someone disciplined, patient, and capable of building something that would outlast his mistakes. One evening, as he stood in the kitchen watching the sunset cast orange light across the wooden floorboards, he realized that he no longer felt like a man running from failure. He felt like a man stepping into his next beginning. The house that had once seemed broken and forgotten now pulsed with possibility. And beneath the staircase, behind the heavy wardrobe, the open safe stood as a testament to everything he was learning, a reminder that sometimes fortune found those who were finally ready to build something that mattered. And as the last daylight faded from the room, Ryan placed the notebook gently on the counter, resting his hand on it for a long moment. He knew the work ahead would not be easy, but he also knew he was no longer doing it alone. He had Drayton's words, his principles, and the house itself, a quiet partner in a future he had not expected, but now felt compelled to pursue. The morning Ryan began the true renovation of the house, the air outside was cool and sharp, carrying with it the scent of wet soil after a night of light rain. The hills surrounding the property glistened faintly under the hesitant sun, and for the first time since he had moved in, the world seemed to mirror the quiet sense of direction forming within him. The house, once a husk of someone else's forgotten life, felt as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for hands willing not just to repair it, but to honor it. Ryan stepped onto the porch with a cup of steaming coffee, breathing in the early stillness, and allowed himself to imagine what the property might one day become. It was no longer an escape from failure. It was the anchor for something new. He spent the first days walking through every room, studying the structure of the house, the way a chef studies his ingredients, feeling out the potential hidden beneath old paint and dust. The living room's walls were solid, the wooden beams strong, the floor sturdy despite years of wear. He removed the peeling wallpaper with patient hands, revealing raw, textured walls he knew could be restored to warmth. In the kitchen, he dismantled the old cabinets, each screw coming undone with a small crack that felt like the release of breath the house had been holding. He scrubbed the entire space down, washing away years of neglect until the counters and floor revealed their grain beneath the grime. It was slow work, repetitive and physically exhausting, but never once did he feel the old rush of frustration that had haunted him during his restaurant years. Now, each motion carried purpose. The basement became his refuge. At night, when fatigue pulled at his muscles, he sat on the cool cement floor with Drayton's notebook open on his lap. He reread the principles, each line sounding clearer and more necessary with each passing day. Build slowly. Work with intention. Correct. Don't complain. When you fail, write down why. He wrote in the margins, notes about mistakes he made during the day, new ideas that came to him while lifting old floorboards, and moments when he felt doubt creeping around the edges of his ambition. Sometimes he would look toward the safe, still half open, and feel almost as though Drayton were sitting beside him in spirit, watching him build, approving in his quiet way. There were challenges, of course. No transformation worth pursuing came without them. On the second week of renovations, Ryan discovered that one of the old water pipes had burst inside the wall behind the kitchen. The dampness had spread silently, rotting a section of the floor and weakening the support beneath it. For a long moment, frustration clawed at his chest, familiar and sharp. In the past, that feeling would have consumed him. He would have panicked, cursed, maybe even abandoned the project. But now he breathed deeply, closed his eyes, and repeated Drayton's principle in a soft whisper. Correct. Don't complain. He spent the next 3 days tearing out rotten boards, replacing pipes, and reinforcing the support beams. It was grueling work. His hands blistered and shoulders ached. But when he stepped back and saw the perfectly aligned boards he had installed, the clean piping, the restored strength of the floor, a quiet pride filled him. He had corrected the problem, and the house, in its silent way, seemed grateful. Each repaired room brought with it new sparks of possibility. The dining room, with its wide windows facing the hills, instantly felt like a future centerpiece. He imagined evening light spilling across tables, the glow of small lamps reflecting off polished wood, the sound of murmured conversation drifting beneath soft music. He measured the space carefully, planning where each table might go, considering the flow of movement, the lines of sight, the small details that could transform the room into something intimate and memorable. He sketched everything in his notebook: floor plans, furniture arrangements, lighting ideas, working with the same care Drayton had once applied to his empire. He no longer acted on impulse, he acted on design. Each day when he read the next section of the notebook, he felt his decisions aligning more naturally with the wisdom outlined in its pages. It wasn't just guidance, it was mentorship. Outside, he cleared the overgrown yard, cutting back weeds that reached his waist, trimming the wild bushes that had twisted along the fence for years. The earth beneath them smelled rich and fertile. He imagined planting herbs, rosemary, thyme, basil, and vegetables he could use in the restaurant's dishes. Fresh ingredients grown steps away from the kitchen would become part of the restaurant's identity, a tribute to simplicity and authenticity. The idea felt right. More than right, it felt necessary. Weeks passed. The renovation grew, and Ryan grew with it. He hardly recognized himself some evenings when he stood in front of the bathroom mirror washing away the dust. His shoulders looked stronger, his posture straighter. The shadows beneath his eyes had lightened, replaced with something steadier. Purpose. He slept deeply each night, waking with a rest he had not known in years. The community took notice. People driving down the hill slowed their cars to glance at the property. Some mornings, as he worked on the porch, neighbors paused at the gate, curious. One elderly man in suspenders and a faded baseball cap stopped more than once, leaning on the fence to talk. He introduced himself as Jerry Collins, a local who had known Drayton personally. They spoke about the old days, how Drayton had lived quietly, how he always seemed to be working on something no one else understood. Jerry told him stories about the townspeople trying to guess how much Drayton was worth, or why he lived the way he did. But mostly, he spoke with admiration. "Good man," Jerry said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "Didn't care for showing off. Lived right. Worked hard. Gave more than he took." Then he looked at Ryan with a thoughtful squint. "Funny how you ended up in his place. Seems like he left it for someone who needed it." Ryan felt the truth of that in his chest. He didn't tell Jerry about the safe or the notebook. Some things felt too intimate, too sacred to share. The turning point came on a warm afternoon when the house was nearly finished. Ryan had been sanding the front door, preparing it for a new coat of paint, when he stepped back and saw the house with fresh eyes. The windows were clean, the siding repaired, the porch rails replaced, the rooms inside filled with new energy and possibility. The house no longer looked abandoned, it looked alive. He entered the kitchen, now restored with polished counters, modern appliances, and warm lighting. The scent of fresh pine from the new cabinets mingled with the faint aroma of herbs growing in small pots by the window. The dining room, now furnished with sturdy wooden tables he had restored himself, glowed under the soft lamps he had installed. Everything felt aligned, harmonious, ready. He stood in the center of the dining room with the notebook in his hands, flipping to the page he had read so many times, he knew it by heart. Know why you're building before you start. He whispered the words and looked around. The answer had become clear long ago. He wasn't building a restaurant to redeem his past failures. He was building one to honor the wisdom of a man who had chosen humility over extravagance, patience over pride. He was building something that felt true. The next step was the menu. He sat at the kitchen table with a stack of blank pages and began to write. At first, the ideas came slowly, but soon they flowed with surprising ease. He envisioned a menu rooted in simplicity, fresh ingredients, thoughtful combinations, dishes that felt like home, but tasted elevated. He designed each plate with the same intentionality he had applied to the renovations, remembering the times he'd worked in kitchens before his own restaurants had failed. Those memories no longer brought shame. They brought experience. He tested recipes for weeks, the kitchen filled with the fragrance of roasted vegetables, simmering sauces, fresh bread. He invited Jerry and a few neighbors to try dishes, asking for honest feedback. Their praise was warm, but their critiques were even more valuable. Each suggestion helped refine the menu, sharpening each dish until it felt complete. Word spread. People began asking when the restaurant would open. The house that had once been a forgotten landmark had become a point of curiosity in the town, a place with potential, a place that seemed to draw people in without explanation. Finally, after months of preparation, Ryan set an opening date. He printed simple flyers and distributed them in town. He cleaned the dining room twice over, polished each table, checked every light fixture, every window pane. On the morning of the opening, he walked through the house slowly, his hand running along the smoothed edges of door frames and countertops, remembering how each corner had once looked and how far it had come. When the first guests arrived just before dusk, the golden light of evening spilled across the porch, welcoming them into the space Ryan had revived with his hands and heart. Jerry was the first to step through the door, smiling proudly as though watching a grandson graduate. Behind him came families, couples, curious neighbors, all stepping inside, their expressions softening as they took in the warm glow of the dining room, the scent of herbs and roasted garlic drifting through the air, the soft music playing from an old speaker. Ryan greeted each guest with quiet gratitude, guiding them to their tables. He worked the kitchen alone that first night, moving with a calm, measured rhythm. He plated each dish with intention, recalling Drayton's principle. Work quietly. Let results speak. And the results did speak, through the murmured compliments, the satisfied smiles, the occasional surprised laugh when a flavor landed perfectly. At one point, as he stepped out of the kitchen to deliver a dish personally, he paused near the doorway of the dining room. Light shimmered across the tables, catching the faces of guests as they leaned in to talk, to eat, to share a moment. And for a heartbeat, he imagined Lawrence Drayton standing beside him, watching everything unfold. Not with pride in his own wealth or lessons, but with contentment that his legacy had become something living, something meaningful. Late that night, after the last guest had left, Ryan stood alone in the dining room. The tables were empty now, but the air still carried the warmth of laughter and conversation. He turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the soft glow of a single lamp in the corner. He looked around at what he had built, what they had built, he and Drayton together, across time, and felt a profound sense of arrival. He walked quietly to the basement, lit the lamp, and opened the notebook to the final page. There, in the shaky handwriting of Drayton's last days, were words he had not fully appreciated until now. Leave something behind that outlasts you. Ryan closed the notebook gently, resting it on the table. He understood now that the house, the restaurant, the entire journey had not been about redeeming the past. It had been about stepping into the future with clarity, humility, and purpose. He had become someone who could build something that breathed, something that mattered. As he climbed the stairs back to the main floor, he felt a quiet peace settle into him. The house felt warm, alive, listening. The restaurant above was silent for now, but he knew the next evening it would glow again, filling with people, with stories, with life. He stepped onto the porch, looking out at the moonlit hills, and breathed deeply. The night was calm. The wind carried the scent of herbs from the garden, and in the distance, the town slept under a blanket of stars. Ryan stood there for a long time, feeling the steady heartbeat of a life rebuilt one careful step at a time. And as he finally turned to go back inside, he whispered into the quiet air, as though speaking to the man whose words had changed his path. It's finished, and it's only beginning. He lost everything in restaurants, and bought an old house to resell with his last money. But inside the closet, he found something he shouldn't have seen. It changed his path and led him where he didn't plan to go. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other videos on the channel and share this one with someone who likes stories like this.